Okay. I have to give you a warning about the reader. I've never done this before, and I'll probably never do this again, and I already regret it, but I already did it in a couple periods, so I'll have to do it for you. There are about 4 essay question answers in this reading pattern. I'm not going to give you any more hints, but suffice it to say that you should study it very carefully. In that reader, um, 43 and 44 are mostly stuff that's interesting for locals. So about energy stuff in your front yard there. Yeah, the whole reader. I believe so, but it might be a slightly outdated reader. I think there's still a couple of copies, and I have one extra. 45 gets 2 stars, and that is the super central concept. Especially this page that says batteries, flywheels, so on. Because here's the problem with alternative energy. When it's available, we may not need it, and when we need it, it may not be available. The key obstacle to alternative energy is you can't flip it on when you want it and flip it off when you're done. So unlike every other energy source, it's not really supply matched to demand. The secret, though, is if we could store the electricity, if we could bank it, then we could, be scavengers for electricity. Hey, it's windy, right on, let's charge the batteries, because later on the wind might stop and we'll need to drain the batteries. So 45 talks about ways that we can store electricity in large volumes. 46 is this thing about how much we love coal and still how bad it is, and how we all know it's evil, but we're going to end up using more and more and more in the future. Funny thing about coal, 47 gets 2 stars. Options for quote-unquote cleaning up the coal. And please look up this article. It's the second half of 47 about how we might sequester the carbon, hide the carbon. You know, the funny thing about coal, the funny thing about any fossil fuel, is fossil fuels are actually a really good idea in many ways. You can make electricity whenever you want it. There's a pretty decent supply of fossil fuels. You can ship them around. It's a lot of energy that's readily available. The only really obvious and major obstacle to fossil fuels is all that carbon. But what if we could just get the CO2 someplace other than the atmosphere? What if we could turn it into concrete or bury it underground. If we could hide the carbon, if we could keep it away from the atmosphere, fossil fuels would become a much more reasonable option. It's not like fossil fuels are inherently evil aside from the CO2, but the CO2 is just a really scary problem. So sequestration lets you have your cake and eat it too. If there is a way to hide the carbon, everything changes in the energy question. 48 is mostly an interesting FYI about flying animals and wind power. 49 doesn't really have stars. It's just what I think is one of the saddest and most amazing stories about energy in the United States. In case you didn't read this article, I kind of wanted to talk about this story because I find it absolutely fascinating. There are these Native Americans in Utah now called the Goshute. If I'm mispronouncing that, please tell me. Their reservation is very close to Salt Lake City, Utah. If I understand the story correctly, and I may not, and I apologize if I'm wrong, I believe that the Goshute used to live in many parts of the Four Corners in Utah, but they were displaced and relocated to their current reservation. Their current reservation, I believe, is not their ancestral land. And the Goshute Indians are, like many other relocated natives, pretty bummed out. They have no attachment to their current home. They have very little way to support themselves, and economically speaking, the Goshute are very, very poor. Many of the social ills of reservation Indians have struck the Goshute. Limited access to medical care, low quality education, a lot of broken families, high rates of violence, domestic violence, type 2 diabetes, nutritional deficiencies, malnutrition, high alcohol use, high tobacco use. A lot of the bummers that we hear about some Native Americans. But the Goshute Indians had an awesome idea. They heard that all over the United States there's nuclear power plants with no place to send their high-level radioactive waste. And they looked around and said, hey, does anybody really like the res? And all the Goshute said, no, if I could afford it, I would leave. And so they did the math, and they were like, hey, Ian, do you want to sign a contract that we can take all your high-level radioactive waste for like a really low price? And every power plant in the U.S. was like, sure. So in a period of like a year and a half, they designed a high-level repository, which was basically like a big parking lot with a fence around it. And then they signed all these contracts, like, sure, we'll take your high-level waste and your high-level waste and your, okay, we're going to start in a year and a half, sounds good, thanks. This is cold calling, like, you want to, sure, okay, great, we'll send you the papers. And so they got all these commitments. And they were, like, talking to each other, like, hey, you guys, there's not a lot of Goshute Indians. They're like, hey, you guys, we've got, like, X number of millions of dollars coming in next year. After we build the power plant and we divide this among the Goshute Indians, in the first year, we're all going to make, like, I forget what the number was, $78,000 each or something. And for people who were living on the edge of abject poverty or even below the poverty level, they were like, wow, that sounds like a pretty good deal. The second, third, fourth years, they're going to start getting into the many thousands of dollars. And so the Indians were like, pumped, like, this is it. We found our ticket off the reservation. We found our way out of poverty. But like many Native American stories, it didn't end well. Both the Fed and the Utah government did not like their plans for high-level repository. So they went to court to block the Goshute Indians from building this on their land. And the Goshute Indians, for a while, looked like they were going to win. Does everybody understand that Indian reservations are considered sovereign land? It's like having diplomatic immunity, right? You're allowed to do basically whatever you want there with very few limits. Because it's kind of like a separate little country with a donut of the United States around it. So the feds were like, dude, you're not allowed to do this. And the Goshute are like, we're not asking permission, it's our dirt now, right? You stuck us here, now this is our dirt. So the feds were like, ooh, right. Yeah. And so for a while, it really looked like this was going to go down. And at the very last minute, there was this agreement between the state and the federal government that said, fine, you're allowed to do whatever you want with the reservation, but we're allowed to do whatever we want with all the roads and railroad tracks that lead to your reservation. And so you can build a nuclear repository if you want, but we're not going to let people deliver the waste to you. And the Goshute came this close from clawing their way out of poverty, but we got them.
Why does federal government not want to happen?
Because it's a pretty hazardous thing.
Putting nuclear waste in places where people want to do it, or what? They weren't going to really. They weren't going to like.
Moving it around. Like, if you want to build a nuclear waste repository in Santa Barbara, you got to jump through a jillion hoops.
Well, also people are living in Santa Barbara.
Well, the argument by people from Utah was that they are very, very close to Salt Lake City. And I don't remember the mileage. It might be in the article. It's also like just transporting it like 50 miles. And so the transportation issue was an excuse. I mean, anywhere we build a repository, we'll have to transport it. But I think this was just like a little states' rights issue. Yeah, it's a NIMBY thing. Like nobody wants it wherever you're going to put it. I personally take no sides in the nuclear repository debate. For me, there's just this sad irony about how we treat our native tribes. And then there's this additional irony about our nuclear power that we all love it, but we still have no plan for the waste.
Also, what's stopping us from like taking all the waste and just putting it in one big hole, like in the middle of nowhere, like in the northern part of Russia?
We just haven't found the place to put the hole.
Really?
Like our only plan right now is keep making waste. Don't worry, we'll start digging soon.
Where is it being put right now?
In a big pile out back. It's like there's no place to take the recycling, so you just throw it out the window into your backyard. But that is exactly the current strategy for disposal is leave it in the backyard. Like literally, it's not like a euphemism. Like all high-level radioactive waste is currently stored on site because there's no other site.
So what if we like?
Why don't we just blast that off the space? Because what if the space explodes?
Yeah, the Challenger, bro. Is why. You remember the Need Another 7 Astronauts joke about NASA? NASA stands for Need Another 7 Astronauts. I think because they unfortunately blew up all the astronauts at one time. Twice actually. 2 times.
Two times.
And the rockets blow up pretty often also. But you know, a lot of times we shoot into space and comes back. And the separate issue is the tonnage we're discussing here. It's not like shooting a satellite, which weighs like a couple hundred pounds and is really fancy. It's like shooting tonnage. Like I'm sure that we don't have enough rockets and we probably have serious limits on the energy load required to just pull that off. By the way, many people have argued that we should build a space elevator as a way to jettison our a synchronous orbit satellite that's connected by a cable. And so you have